very much. Hello. Hi, everybody. So, yes, I'm Leif Isaksen. I work at the University of Exeter, where I'm Director of Digital Humanities there. I've got some good news and some bad news about this kind of presentation. So the first thing is I changed the title, which used to say something on the lines of spatial data infrastructures for the humanities, challenges and solutions. So the first bad news, I have no solution. Or rather, that's not quite true. I have some solutions, and some of you will know that, for example, for a very long period of time, I've been heavily involved with the Pelagios network, which in various ways has kind of tried to develop a number of linked open data type solutions to things. But I'm not going to talk about that at all today. So, so for those of you who have heard me talk about it before, you may be relieved to hear that I'm going to say that again. And secondly, but yeah, there's plenty of time for us workshop to discuss those kinds of things. So what I wanted to do instead was perhaps focus a little bit on some challenges and to be a bit of a provocation. So the title here is Keeping a Sense of Perspective and thinking specifically about what kinds of spatial data infrastructure we might want in the humanities. Oh, and yes, what I want to try and persuade you of by the end of this keynote is that this beach ball can, in some context at least, be an even better spatial data infrastructure than anything that we can, or that can develop there. Or for those of you who are watching kind of online, I have a small rubber bouncy ball which has a similar effect. All that do. Yeah. Great. Okay. So yeah. So keynotes should be provocations, hopefully, to kind of get us thinking about stuff over the course of the next few days. And I'm going to play a little bit on that turn of phrase, sort of a sense of perspective, right? So the first sense, in which I mean it's a sense of perspective, and to be kind of provocative, is to think about what we, as specifically as humanists, might contribute in general to this kind of field. And one thing I'm going to propose, and feel free to throw soft objects like beach balls and so on at me, is that humanists in particular probably do not need to spend a lot of time developing the kind of the geometric component of spatial data infrastructures, so things like vector and raster and topological elements, because those are already the subject of really rapid development, have been for some time. They're fields that we can borrow, and there's always the risk that we will do something that's kind of great and then find that it's already kind of superseded by other folks. Sorry, that's my mother calling undoubtedly. See how it's going. Thanks. So the second sense in which I want to kind of talk about a sense of perspective is that I think that humanists should focus on developing components that help capture the relationship between human beings on the one hand and space and place on the other. I'm going to talk about that in three possible kind of dimensions, if you will: observations, scope, and worldviews. This is by no means, like it's kind of a comprehensive list. Again, it's just a way to kind of get us thinking. And each of these, I'll kind of give a context to some of my own research to kind of give an idea about why I think that those things are particularly important when working with spatial information. And yes, for a moment again, I am not going to talk about the Pelagios. That's a subliminal way of making you all think about what is this Pelagios now. Okay, so the first of these. Okay, so observations. What do I mean kind of by observation? Well, there, what I really mean is how can we bring in information? I'm not the details here, right? How can we the importance of people talking about humanistic information that we might care about? I'm afraid my first two case studies are going to be quite archaeological. The third one, again, will be kind of quite pleased there is not. So the case study here is a hill fort, a supposed hill fort that I heard about. It's actually from my hometown, so I'm from the north of Scotland, a place called Cluny Hill. It's just off the coast, about 5 miles from the coast. You can see with the map here. And then in 1815, it had this rather nice kind of tower as a monument to Nelson that was built on it. And there's been something of a debate over a very long time about whether it is a debate. When I first heard it, I first read about Hillport there about 10 years ago. I thought, I grew up there and I never heard of Hillport, so kind of what's kind of going on? And I wanted to know more about it. Well, if you kind of do some antiquarian research, it turns out that as early as 1803, on the earliest map of Forres, which is the local town, there is indeed actually a picture here of Flutie Hill, and there's a really kind of wonderful hill fort and a description of a hill fort that kind of comes with it in a note. So there we go, kind of that's done and dusted, right? So we know that there's a hill fort there because somebody said that. However, if you look at contemporary maps of the hill fort, then you'll see if you look at the Ordnance Survey in the 1905 edition, then you can see over here, right, it's marked as being site of hill fort. However, in 1984, right, it's disappeared. So the good people of the Ordnance Survey have decided that actually, there's not really enough evidence here to justify the claim that there is some kind of hill fort. So another thing we can do is go back to Canmore, which for those some of you may be familiar with, which is the absolutely fantastic online database of national heritage and archaeological sites and finds for the historic environment of Scotland. That has an entry for Cluny Hill that rather kind of clearly says classification fort. Okay, so that's great because now we've got more information. The problem, and this is really fundamental to what we're talking about here, right, is that all databases are, of course, based on data that comes from somewhere else. There's nothing particularly, the structure of this information system has no implications for the actual data that goes into it. And in this case, as with much of the information that is in kind of Canmore, it comes from the Ordnance Survey, right? And a bunch of paper database, an index card database that has descriptions about this kind of hill fort. So the fact that it's online doesn't make it any more reliable, and modern doesn't make it any more reliable than the original data that we just kind of brought into question, and where the Ordnance Survey decided that there wasn't a hill fort. Right? So we're already kind of in a place of tension. Okay, well then, what if we go back to our archaeological reference? Right, let's start trusting the kind of scientists is the right word, but the professionals certainly. Turns out that lots of people have written books about hill forts in Scotland, and lots of those contain references to the hill. So, okay, much more evidence. Now we've got the academics involved. Surely that's a sign of trust. The problem is that down here, as you can see, there's kind of quite a lot of publications, but each of them are just saying, yes, I know there's a hill fort because there's a prior publication that says there's a hill fort. And we can trace these back into a whole series of Chinese whispers that come all the way back to a guy called Hibbert, who goes back to Bristol Anderson, who comes right back to Chalmers, which is the book I just told you about, right? So actually, despite us having lots of information from academics, none of that information adds anything to the original publication. So that's why I'm really interested in observations, in mechanisms that will, although we might care about sort of spatial information, how can we sort of start drawing in particular references? And so in this case, we can go back to 1887, and there's a guide for it, like a tourist guide, where somebody says it's believed there is an ancient kind of camp there. There are faint traces of an artificially level belt, the circle, which is the rampart, and the trees were planted around that. So this guy hasn't actually seen the hill fort himself, but he's kind of within memory of people doing things with what they thought was a hill fort. Another really important reference here is a guy who walks past the hill fort whilst he's passing through Forres, and he says a little to the east of the town is Clover Hill. He's actually misnamed the hill. Cloven Hill is a different name for the same hills, and that's in a letter from 1760, so that predates our original source. That means he wasn't drawing on Chalmers, no way he could have been, right? But he's writing, he only gets published in 1887, right? So he can't in turn have influence. So we're starting to, okay, well, we actually now have two different sources who are talking about hill fort that they kind of claim to have seen. Newspaper articles as well. So here, the guy who planted the trees was the editor of the newspaper, and he has various articles where he says, yes, that this one was here, but it was actually destroyed by people making a hill apart. And I was there when it happened. And then finally, by digging into the archives of the guy who wrote the book in 1803, he actually has a letter from somebody from the local vicar who basically says, yes, you want to come. He was actually interested in something entirely different, an important standing stone that's in the area. It says, you might be interested in this hill fort we've got in here. And then he nicely kind of describes it. And so we can see that he is the source for that book. So what we want to do is we can then if we had, I should say, spatial data infrastructures that were capable of identifying toponymy, that were helpful, would help us draw upon observations, contemporary and historical, and pull that in, then we could then start to make use of that and project it into the spatial information that we have as well. So here we can take that information, talking about the line of the rampart here, how it largely follows the lines of paths. We can take LiDAR, for example, here with kind of false color, and track out and lay out the line of the rampart. And then, of course, in an ideal spatial data infrastructure, and another perspective we want is the three-dimensional perspective. So here we can just start to see, for example, the lines of this. So this is a path, the really straight one, and here we sort of see how this sloping rampart, which is obviously the thing that they're talking about. And as a consequence of bringing that information together, so going back to historical sources and not merely relying on spatial information, but bringing them together, we were able to use that as the basis for getting funding for a dig, which in turn, sure enough, showed that it was an INH hill fort. We were able to, we were able to kind of find halves, so we could kind of carve a date to the period. So one of the things that I really want in any kind of data infrastructure is ways of say, discovering, most importantly, and this is really hard because as we saw with the case of Clover Hill, for example, toponymy doesn't always work, right? He also describes, if I can go back briefly here. Oh yes, so this was an entrenchment of the Danes, right? He's not talking about the Iron Age, he's not talking about hill forts. He's clearly talking about the same thing, but he's misidentified it and he's misnamed it, and yet it's one of the most important sources that we have available. So metadata in and of itself is not always helpful, right? Sometimes we have to kind of come past that and look beyond it.
But isn't date just it's just a synonym for the ancients?
In this context, it's not. The reason people are Danes is because there's a major standing stone that's called Swano stone, because it was assumed to be because of Viking incursions to the northeast. We now know that that's not the case at all, but that's the context, I think, in which they were thinking about it in this particular case. But yes, and frequently that is the case. And even terms like Iron Age are impossibly problematic. Certainly when you kind of think about it across the whole the context of Scandinavia and Northern Europe, and in the context of the UK, Iron Age in Scotland means something completely different from Iron Age in England. Okay, so second kind of issue to kind of a challenge, all of these again being kind of challenges, how can we work these things in, is a question of scope. So here's another project again. So this actually came about, funnily enough, for reasons become clear in a moment, from the Cleary Hill dig. So in the early 19th century, there was a rather dramatic claim that was made by an antiquarian in Exeter, where I work, about the discovery of large numbers of early Greek coins that were being found in the High Street and associated areas that were there. So he wrote a number of kind of short publications, and then that was followed up by this book, Silver and Ghana, where, along with the kind of Roman finds, he documents the circumstances of the discovery of all of these coins. It must be said, rather, what seems very excitedly until you realize that this book is really a series of newspaper clippings, again, he's written, which are kind of designed to kind of entertain the local populace, right, and then kind of brought them all together. So there are kind of quite a few flights of fancy, right, in and amongst the archaeological antiquarian reporting. However, at the same, so he kind of publishes these, and as perhaps you might expect, gets a certain degree of pushback from other professionals, notably this one here from John Ackerman in the very first volume of the Numismatic Chronicle, where he says, I consider our duty to declare our total unbelief in the discovery of Greek coins in Exeter. There are no authenticated accounts of discoveries in Greek coins in Britain, and we've been at some pains to ascertain this fact. Hundreds and thousands of Roman coins have been found in London, but no Greek coins. These and refuse Roman coins purchased half a crown a dozen. It's pretty well known afterwards what becomes of them. Right. So his view is we're not finding this stuff in London. So there's absolutely no way that you guys out in the provinces are finding this, this stuff. Which is, as you also see, it's not an unreasonable position to take. over time, right, a whole range of kind of Greek and Egyptian material has kind of turned up, in particular, in surrounding Exeter, but particularly around the center. This is the line, for example, of the Roman and later medieval wall. And you can sort of see what is roughly the kind of like old kind of tradition of the, the division of the Roman city. And most of the coins in bulk are all found kind of that very central location, but we find them in all sorts of places and beyond. Also, this kind of wonderfully creepy, in my view, sistrumets, musical instrument of Isis that was found in what we think may have been a Roman bath, again, in very close proximity to some of these coins. And the fact that these kind of kept popping up again and again and again led other archaeologists to say, well, led to, again, a rather kind of furious debate about, people sort of saying this stuff keeps turning up. Maybe it's evidence of kind of ancient trade with the East. Remember, Exeter is in the southwest of England, very famous for the kind of the Cornish tin trade, for example, and theories around that. With other archaeologists, antiquarians, and numismatists who said it's nonsense. Please, can we stop? Just stop with the Greek coins. But one thing that's worth kind of pointing out is that the claim sometimes made of like, oh well, we find them in the southwest of England as well, as some other examples of this. So maybe it is about the tin trade, or no, we really don't find many at all. Both of those are kind of bogus claims. One thing that's important is that Exeter is not terribly special, right, in terms of where we have found these kinds of kind of coins in Britain. And in fact, the reason I became interested in the first place was finding them in a museum right up in the northeast of Scotland by Cleany Hill, that led me to kind of like wondering what they were doing up in that neck of the woods. So we find a lot of coins in a kind of a real spread throughout the British Isles. We should also then look at the comparison where, so here, this is an overlay in green of Roman coin finds. So the latest of these tetradrachms, for example, are dated at the end of the 3rd century. These are known as the British usurpers. So they, when the first Brexit, if you will, when Britain kind of pulls away from the Roman Empire and mint their own coins, right? So that gives us a kind of a snapshot of the Roman economy in that period. And what you can see is there's not really any kind of association between where we find those Roman coins and where we find these kind of Greek coins. So it's not tin trade on the one hand, and it doesn't seem to be Roman stuff on the other. That's also supported by looking here. This is Roman rural sites in England and Wales. Doesn't include Scotland. Of course, there aren't a lot of Roman rural sites in Scotland. Really oddly, there are places where there's almost an inverse kind of relationship. It's kind of hard to say places where you kind of get gaps in one and clusters of the other. Right, so we might be tempted to kind of think, okay, well, maybe this is, as is often proposed, is people kind of coming back from the war, for example, and kind of and bring stuff with it, even if we found lots of these, certainly before the first 2 world wars, and indeed in some cases the Napoleonic wars, until you then sort of start to look and find that we actually know we find these things like all over, oddly, mostly Northern Europe. Like we don't actually seem to kind of find them in the South so much. There's a real kind of emphasis of them kind of over here. So when I start talking about scope, the first thing to kind of bear in mind is that lots of people's perceptions about what this may or may not be is entirely dependent on the scope of the data that they've looked at, right? It's making claims based on nothing other than I was looking over here, right? Or I was looking over here, or this is stretched to the other. So it's really important for us to think about whenever we're doing sort of spatial stuff, the ways in which we're already putting constraints on what we're looking at, and thinking about the ways that might change our interpretations. Returning to the kind of composition of the Exeter coins, we could get into a lot of detail here, and I'm just going to overly sort of simplify it, but the 3 kind of biggest sets of coins that we found are interesting because we can sort of see that the great bulk of them, essentially, kind of at least 3/4, in some cases more, are from either Alexandria, Egypt, or from Antioch and its surrounding kind of hinterlands, with some other Eastern mints as well. These 3 major kind of groups of coins, and the question must have arrived together, and then at some way have been sort of split up. But that's interesting because it gives us 2 particular zones, if you will, to kind of like look at. So we can thinking spatially, right? These coins, they may not all be from the same mint, but they do clearly kind of come from these localized geographic areas. But then we also find in exactly the same areas, finds Byzantine coins as well. And if we look at the dates, and then those coins come not predominantly from Antioch and from Alexandria, but they come, often from Constantinople or Thessalonica as well. But if we look at the dates of those coins, they kind of come in two peaks. There's one that's quite early and one that's quite late. And then looking here at the dates of the Byzantine occupation, right, or until the kind of the Islamic conquest, you can sort of see that the first group basically stops as soon as you get the Islamic conquest, right? And then the second group comes at exactly about the moment here, right, where we have the Byzantine reconquest of Antioch. And there's a quirky little bit here where, because there's a few years difference between the conquest of Egypt and the Levant, some of these just kind of squeaking under the border when a period when Egypt is still under Byzantine control, but Antioch is not. So temporally, although spatially, right, these coins seem to be associated with other cities, temporally they're associated with specific periods where Byzantium is in control of exactly the areas where we found the other coins, right? So if we think about, they're exactly the kinds of Byzantine coins we might expect, the kind of kinds you would expect to find in those places, particularly in Antioch, at some point, following the period where the Byzantines get kicked out briefly, and then you have the Crusades. So Arabic coins, we've got a big gap, right? What's kind of going on there? Suddenly it turns out when we reread the text that in the middle of that, they just say, oh yeah, we also found these Arabic coins. They don't describe what the Arabic coins are. They get completely kind of kicked to the side. There's something else explaining those. And yet actually we have this kind of interesting gap in the middle. And a visit to, there's this great reference here to like another coin much defaced, the Arabic of Cubic characters found in the company proceeding, many such pieces of money having been dug up in Exeter before. Where are these Arabic coins that suddenly that nobody talks about, that they're being referenced here? And a visit to the museum turns up a coin packet that says Arabic coins found in 1810 in the Broadgate. So this is the area where we found those other coins. Maybe 57. I don't know. Right? So we have the coin packet, and now we're in the process of trying to kind of hunt down these coins. This is ongoing research, and I don't know where this is going to kind of take us. But what's interesting is there's the kind of convolution of, in some cases, where we want to look at stuff spatially and see associations between stuff. And there are other cases where we want to look at things temporally and see stuff together. And in each case, the way that we and other people have defined the scope of a problem has real implications for the way that we actually do that research and the way that we interpret it. So the idea that a coin is in any way kind of objective, that we can like look at it and understand it without that kind of context is of course kind of like nonsense. That much has always been clear. The hard part is, okay, so if that isn't clear, then what are the processes by which we can define scope or allow the flexibility of scope to evolve with our research questions? Finally, how are we doing for time? We're good. Right. So the last thing is worldviews. So this is one of my favorite maps, as I'm sure I can maybe for those of you who know it. This is MacArthur's universal corrective map of the world. I probably don't need to tell you that Stuart MacArthur is Australian, right? So his concern, right, is not with data, right? His concern is not with where things are in the world, or that there are some things, there aren't others, whatever else. His concern is the worldview that is projected by kind of conventional projections. So he's turned it upside down, right? And the response, the reason it's the reason for its existence, the reason that it receives a chuckle from us, right, and that we kind of think about it, is because innately, when we look at a map like this, we know that something is wrong at the same time as accepting that factually there's nothing incorrect about it at all, right? There is some part of us where it sits uncomfortably. It's a kind of unheimlich, I think, is the German expression for how we deal with these things which are familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. But MacArthur was not obviously the very first person to do that. And if we go into Islamic world mapping, then that actually is the norm. So this is the very famous Tabula Gariana prepared for Al-Idrisi in the 12th century. in Sicily, and the orientation of this, so far, this map never existed. It exists as a series of kind of component maps, as well as a circular world map that we'll kind of come to as well. But the orientation is with ostensibly south at the top. And just to point things out, so here's the Iberian Peninsula, of course, just so you can orient yourself, if you will. Right, this is the Mediterranean, that's the Indian Ocean, and this is Africa, for example. Great. So, although that's a very famous one, we can kind of trace this back, so we can kind of point to other Islamic world maps. So here we've got the circular world map from the Book of Curiosities, very similar to the Idrisi world map, and there's a kind of, again, a debate about whether in fact that's the kind of the source for Idrisi circular world map. The so-called Balkhi school from this example being the Book of Eurasian Kingdoms, which kind of pushes yet further back, much more schematic in form, if you like, but still kind of oriented with south at the top. We can go further back, and one thing just to kind of important to look at here, to often be noticed, is this what I call the mountains of the moon. So if you the Nile, so this is the Nile coming down here, and you can see that mountain at the top. So this is important because it's a feature which seems to reoccur through the map, and that in turn seems to go back to the world map of Al-Khwarizmi. We don't have Al-Khwarizmi's world map, and Al-Khwarizmi really, in fact, gives us a set of coordinates. It's a kind of textbook or a dot-to-dot drawing, if you will, for a map, where the orientation itself is not precise. And in fact, it seems, rather than it being a manual for world drawing, one of which we're about to kind of come to, it's more a kind of recording of something that Al-Khwarizmi seems to be seeing. But again, we can see the similarities, and again, we can see these lakes here and the mountains of the moon, and the Nile flowing down here into the Mediterranean. Why is this important? It's important because it shows, and an overlay would make much kind of clearer, that the map that Al-Khwarizmi is, respectively, either kind of showing you how to draw or recording, is derived in very substantively, not entirely, but very substantively, from Ptolemy's world map from the middle of the 2nd century. And why is that important? It's important because Ptolemy's world map is explicitly north-oriented, right? The maps that we know maps have come down to us, they're almost certainly Byzantine copies, but they're based on a text that tells you how to draw maps, and the text itself explicitly says, conventionally, we draw north as up. So we know that the maps of Ptolemy are north-facing. We know that the Islamic maps are derived from Ptolemy, and yet the Islamic maps seem to be south-facing. So something has happened in the middle, and we don't know what. And lots of people have kind of come up with kind of various theories about this. The most common is that Mecca has something to do with it, and there's a kind of an orientation in the Islamic world that Mecca is always south, which of course is not true for the Islamic world, but it's it's a handy theory if you're short of something else. So this leads to kind of several interrelated problems, some of which we haven't kind of gone into here. But so why are these Islamic maps apparently reversed from their source material? Why don't they just reuse Ptolemy's projection? Right, he actually gives a whole, again within the geography, a whole set of rules about how to draw maps. And yet, despite using the data, obviously, that comes with the rules, they don't apply the same rule. They don't use the same kind of projections. They change from Ptolemy's continental, so-called continental model. This is in kind of going back. So, so for Ptolemy, this is the Indian Ocean is an enclosed sea, and Africa and Asia are actually kind of connected together with and going further back. And that's not true of the Islamic ones, right? You actually have to just kind of break the ocean kind of breaks out, if you like, to the broader ocean. So there's something going on there as well. They're always constrained within 180 degrees. Also odd because Khwarizmi adds a whole bunch of extra stuff to Ptolemy's map, and yet instead of just saying, well, Ptolemy's is 180 degrees, so now that will take us to 190 degrees, he squeezes everything, says everything else has to be pushed so he can fit in the new stuff. And again, important implications for medieval Islamic worldviews. So people have looked at maps for many years for this, and there hasn't been a kind of an obvious solution has not really kind of presented itself. Likewise, I spent a lot of time looking at geographic information systems, and obvious solutions haven't presented themselves. But if we turn back to the world views, if you will, of people in the Greek world, in the Islamic world, then it turns out that a possible solution starts to present itself. So one is, so that's to think about the way that in a kind of God's eye view, how do people talk about the Earth and the cosmos, which of course famously, right, is a geocentric cosmos. It's not the Earth going around the sun, but the Earth is central. And also one in which the Earth doesn't spin, right? The Earth is stationary, and other stuff spins around it. We can go way back to Empedocles here, 5th century, and he describes the whole cosmos as essentially being like water in a cup, right? So you can think it's creating a vortex. There's debate about whether things get kind of pulled up and down, but there's this kind of spinning column, if you like, of water that represents the cosmos. If we go look at Plato, he talks in the Republic, in this wonderful description about kind of like experiencing the enormity of the kind of the cosmos, that the central kind of axis is being initially like a pillar, and then he describes it as they got closer as what we describe the spindle of necessity, right? So this is a nice diagram of the spindle of necessity. So kind of hanging on a cord, spinning around, this kind of great underpinning to carry the universe around it. And the wall, that's the spinning weight there as well. Eratosthenes in his geography also he used the metaphor of a spindle wall again to describe the inhabited parts of the Earth. So let's come to our beach ball here. For those of you who are watching, right, here is our little rubber ball, right? And so you have the oikumene, the inhabited kind of quarter of the Earth, which is over here, and then it's water at the back, right? And then water at the bottom. So here you have a wall, and then he divides it yet again. Aristotle's wonderful because he sort of accepts exactly this model, but he says you're all wrong for reasons which are a little bit arcane, because yes, it's polar, right? But actually, rather than us on the top, as the Pythagoreans would have it, we're really on the bottom, right? Conventionally, we are like exactly as MacArthur says, right, on the bottom of this. This is the lower region, the upper region. We just think, right, we're on top because it feels like it's on top to us, but that's actually really got nothing to do with the way that the universe is, right? It's just our personal biases. And then returning to Ptolemy, okay, so he's in his Almagest, where he's talking about cosmos in general. There's no real up or down, right? We can acknowledge that these are just kind of fictions. But he two kind of telling things. The world of world cartography is a general view analogous to making a portrait of a head. So he describes the world as being like a head, right? Which of course has a natural axis to it, right? And Aristotle takes us draws similar kind of parallels. And then our convention is that up, with respect to mapmakers, means north, and that right is to the east in the oikumene, both on a globe and a planar map, right? So he's really explicit about this. And in all of these Greek authors, we have this kind of notion of the world as we think of it, right, in kind of contemporary kind of European and indeed Middle Eastern society, probably kind of best to say, that looks just like this. But if we turn to Islamic scholars who's talking about the world, and again, we know that they were referring to many of the same things here. Globe being almost entirely surrounded by the deep waters of the Great Sea, the northern quarter that we inhabit, right? So that's our bit over here. Southern quarter is deserted because of the excessive heat which prevails there. The other half of the Earth lying below us, right, has no inhabitants, right? So he talks about this hemisphere as somehow being beneath us. Al-Masudi's meadows of gold mines of gems, the sphere makes the daily revolution turn around an axle, right? So you think of like a vehicle, right? Where it's something that's horizontal, right? It's not vertical. Or the wheel of a carpenter or turner who makes balls and boxes articles of wood. And again, they disagree about the axles upon which the heavens rest, whether they are movable, whether they have any rotary motion. This is not an Islamic example, but it is a reminder that lathes, right, kind of turning things, are horizontal in nature because you don't want your object to be just sliding up and down the lathe. You want it to be stable. Al-Muqaddasi's best divisions, so some have made a comparison between the celestial sphere and the turners, where it's using a hollowed out object having a walnut inside it. So again, comparing it to a lathe, but here with a walnut in the kind kind of the middle. And then in Drisi, the ocean sea surrounds around half the globe continuously. It's a circular sea, so it appears to be a half, as if it were, say, an egg immersed in water, which would be contained in a cup, right? But we know that for Drisi, it goes like the landmass goes below the equator, so that's not the half that he's talking about. So returning now to why this is a much better spatial data infrastructure than using a computer. For those of you who are here, which is kind of fairly straightforward. If we think about the Greek way of looking at the world, right, like this, with a vertical axis, you're forced to look at it here, north orientation, because if you turn it around, right, if you turn it south, then you wind up just looking at the sea, right? Your perspective, right, is not kind of very helpful. But conversely, if we think about the orientations being horizontal, right, you're forced to look at it from the other direction as well, because again, you just wind up looking at the sea, right? If that's your orientation. If you take the beach ball and try it out, you'll see there's really only one solution, right? It's really straightforward. Okay, so there are two ways you can look at it. If you're looking at the world, right, depending on your orientation, either like this or like this, right? This doesn't work, and this doesn't work. And if we take, say, a 3D model of this and we kind of compare it, right, to the, for example, Idrisi's maps, you can see that they're actually, this is not a view, or this just simply being reversed north-south, right? It's a view looking onto the Earth, right, from the North Pole. So again, I'll give you the little ball. It makes much more sense. Right, trying it out. Okay, so this is nothing like Ptolemy's map. It's like somebody looking at a globe, right, with its kind of primary orientation through the middle. Okay. And we can see, so this is an anonymous treatise from the 12th century, where they really nicely kind of give it a whole series of projections of the world there. But in this case, they kind of again show something very similar, again with the water hemisphere below. So why is that? Well, it seems, I don't know, and of course here we start kind of getting conjecture about why this transformation appears to have occurred. One of those, I suspect, is so here we can think of it like the celestial axis, the kind of a Greek cosmology, and importantly, cosmology where there is no one all-seeing God. Right? You might have Olympus, right? But apart from that, the world exists somehow in the middle of the universe. So we have it as an object, right? It's got a vertical pole, and the path of the fixed stars kind of rotates around it. But in the not only in the Islamic tradition, but also kind of Christian and Jewish traditions, there is another axis that is equally, if not more important, right? Which we can kind of think of as like the heavenly axis or planar axis, where God is above us, right, and hell is below us. And so there's a very genuine, real question about, well, if that's true, then what is the nature of that axis, and how does it relate to the nature of this axis as well? And it may be we take something like this, where there's a kind of a sense that because the inhabited kind of area extends along the equator, then having kind of God suspended above the North Pole, like Santa Claus or something, is inherently sort of odd, because there's a whole big part that's just water, right? It's nothing kind of really kind of going on, and there's another part that's almost beneath and outside of that field of vision. Whereas this way is a much more natural sort of sense, where they kind of have a sort of sense of being above the world, right, and as a natural sort of symmetry that kind of runs through it. So it may be, and I am speculating, kind of conjecturing, that it may be an attempt to try and, if you like, kind of bring together these two important axes to out of tension. So to finish up, in my view, we need spatial infrastructure that, as well as, of course, having linked open data and geometry and all of the other kind of good stuff, one that help us discover, interpret, and compare historical sources, right? And that can include things like, as well as maps, text, and images, that help us and assist us in that process of expanding and contracting the spatial and temporal scope of our data, right? Where we're not merely reliant on, like, this is the data set I've got, so I'm going to allow that to define for me what my answers are in advance, but actually thinking about how we can kind of cut across those data sets and try things out. And that also, really importantly, might allow us for alternative cosmologies and worldviews and orientations, because that's how human beings understand the world. Right? If we're doing things that force us to look at the world in a very specific way, then it may automatically rule out a whole range of irrespective of whether I may be completely wrong, right, about this. There's a theory, that's fine. The important question is, how do we have infrastructures that would enable us to conceptualize the ways in which other people have conceptualized it in the past? But of course, that's just my point of view. So over the next few days, I'm really looking forward to hearing. So thank you very much. And thank you for having me this workshop. It's really great to be here. Thank you.
Stop the recording. Thank you so much, Leif, for that.
Water.